Good morning, everybody. Boker Tov. Happy Thursday. I hope you had a wonderful Yom Ha'atzmaut yesterday, a wonderful Israeli Independence Day. I was so happy to get over to Seacrest and see a few of you as I delivered Israeli flags. And most of you are looking, not most of you, all of you are looking great. You are a sight for sore eyes. I really needed to see you. It looks like a lot of you need a haircut just like I do, but vanity, right? Thank God we're healthy and we're doing well. And it was really good to see you. Thank you to the culinary department for making the wonderful Israeli lunch, the falafel, a little bit of a taste of Eretz Yisrael. And my hope is that next year we have a huge blowout happy birthday Israel party, which we couldn't have this year, but God willing, next year we will. So we're going to continue our study of Pirkei Avot, a section of the Mishnah that I really love. And we had gotten through some very introductory pieces of this particular Mishnah. We were introduced to what we call Shalshelet HaTorah, the chain of tradition, the chain of the Torah, how it got from Moses to Joshua, to the prophets, or to the elders, to the prophets, to the man of the great Sanhedrin, then to this guy named Shimon HaTzadik, who was one of the last members of the men of the Great Assembly. I'm sorry, not the Sanhedrin, the men of the Great Assembly. And eventually it's going to get down to us because, look, we're sitting here and studying it today, many, many, many centuries later. It's the year 2020. We believe that the Mishnah was codified about the year 250 to 300. And so 1800 years, we're still studying this text for good reason. It's still got lots of great stuff in it. So I introduced you to this guy by the name of Antigonus of Soho. And then when we last studied this before we had a break for Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, I introduced you to the two Yoses. And the the Mishnah of Pirkei Avot begins to get us into these pairs of sages where one said such and such and one said such and such. These two Yosis, the only thing they have in common is their first name. They are not related. One is Ben Yoezer, son of Yoezer. He was a man living in an area called Zeredah. And then Yosei ben Yochanan, son of Yochanan, who was from Jerusalem. And they received the oral tradition from them. So this always goes back to the last sage, the last pair, or the last sages for whom these two are now coming. So it's this ongoing chain. Remember the paper chains you used to make, where you took construction paper and you cut it into thin strips and you wrapped it around and glued it and you made chains that you could decorate things with? That's what this is like. We are going from Moses, and now we are down to these two Yoses, Yosei ben Yoezer and of Zaredah, and Yosei ben Yochanan of Jerusalem. And they got this from Shimon the righteous and Antigonus. And Yosei ben Yoezer, so he's the first of the two Yoses, he used to say, "Let thy house be a house of meeting for the sages, and sit in the very dust of their feet, and drink in their words with thirst." So he was somebody who realized the extreme importance of learning from the sages who were older than he and the ones who could impart their wisdom to him. So you probably had, when you were in high school, college, maybe even grammar school, a teacher whom you really, really loved. And felt like when you were learning with them or from them that you were drinking in their words. And this is really what Yosef ben Yoazer is saying. He's saying that we show incredible deference to these wonderful sages who are going to teach us so much. And he's encouraging Jews to make their homes into a place of gathering where sages can come. You know, maybe it's kind of like the uh, early version of the salon in France, the salons where the poets and the writers and the artists used to gather, the philosophers, and they would share their wisdom with one another. So, a home is supposed to be a gathering place for sages, and one should literally sit at the dust at their feet, which reflects the custom of the day whereby the sage would sit on a chair and the disciple would sit at the sage's feet. And during this period in history, the fixed study halls, the yeshivot, uh, such as existed in later times, especially in Babylonia, during the late Talmudic period, those did not exist yet. They did not have these formalized schools, these formalized yeshivot. So a sage would come, maybe from their own community or from another community, and all the disciples would sit at their feet and they would learn. So learning the oral Torah, which, as I explained, is part of what the Mishnah is, was done, it was performed, it was recited, it wasn't read. So it would be like learning poetry from somebody who was reciting it. So the disciples would sit in these small disciple circles. You wouldn't have a crowd of 1,000 people, but a small group of disciples would sit at the feet, usually centered around this sage who was a charismatic leader who would be the teacher. And that sage, that teacher, would recite something, and the disciples would repeat it. And when that leader, when that sage passed away, the center of learning often moved to wherever a new leader had kind of arisen and was located. So it was a moving classroom, but it was always in the home of one of these sages. I mean, you wouldn't expect the sage to come to your house. You're going to go to them. And that so these little disciple circles existed here, there, and everywhere. And when Yosef ben Yoazer says, drink in their words with thirst, what he is doing is he's comparing Torah to water, which is a very common metaphor that's used in rabbinic literature, where the Torah, as we know, is the tree of life. We're supposed to drink in the words of the Torah, and so we drink in the words of the sage. And as you know, water can eventually wear down a rock, right? We've all seen mountains, we've seen boulders, we've seen rocks that have been worn down over many, 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 many years, over geologic time, that have been worn smooth by water. And similarly, water can seep into the hardened minds of human beings. And so even those who've never learned before. So that's why this metaphor of drink in the thirst, because the more you drink, the more will seep in and the more irrigated you will become in the words of Torah. So I love what Yosef Ben Azariah had to say. I think it was, Ben Zareda used to say. I think it's a beautiful introduction. Okay, now in chapter 1, Mishnah 5, that was chapter 1, Mishnah 4, we're going to hear from his zugot, his partner, his twin. And this Mishnah, let me read to you what it used to say. He would say, let thy house be wide open, and let the poor members of your household. So in the previous Mishnah from the other Yossi, we learned that you should open your house to the sages. And in this Mishnah, we are learning that you should open your house to the poor. So I wonder if that doesn't give us some insight into the two different Yoses and what their, what they felt was more important. Maybe for one of them, it was learning, and for the other one, it was being an open-hearted person who would leave their door open for the poor. So this second sage of the pair, Yosei ben Yochanan of Jerusalem, there's a midrash that makes an interesting note on this chapter so far. And as you know, Shimon the righteous, in the second Mishnah, he said three things. He said, the world stands or depends on three things: Torah, worship, and acts of piety. And then Antigonus, who we studied, this guy who had the Greek name, said that you do stuff not because you're going to get a reward for it. You have to act like the servant who serves the master, meaning God, not because you expect a reward, but because it's the right thing to do. So here we have the first three Mishnayot that kind of talk about al shlosha devarim, al haTorah, v'al ha'avodah, v'al gimilut chasadim. Because Antigonus spoke about serving the master, Yossi ben Yoazer spoke of Torah, and now Yosei ben Yochanan is speaking of acts of piety, acts for the poor. So here Shimon the righteous said, the world stands on three things. Then Antigonus talks about the first of them, which is servitude. The next one, the first Yosei, talks about study, Torah, the sages. And the third one talks about Gimilut Chasadim, acts of loving kindness. So you see how this chain is kind of developing through the various statements that we're going to get from these sages as they introduce themselves to us and tell us what they think is important. And I need a sip of coffee. Okay. But Yossi ben Yochanan, by the way, used to say two things. The first was, let your house be wide open and let the poor be members of your household. Don't treat them any differently. Invite them in, feed them if they need a place to sleep, and so on. But here's the second thing he said, which also gives us some insight into the sages, into their behavior, and into what they thought. And he said, engage not in too much conversation with women. They said this with regard to one's own wife. How much more does the rule apply with regard to another man's wife? From here, the sages said, as long as a man engages in too much conversation with women, he causes evil to himself. He neglects the study of Torah, and in the end, he will inherit Gehinnom. Now, what is Gehinnom? Gehinnom is the Jewish version of hell, Gehenna, Gehinnom. So by chit-chatting with women or letting them chit-chat with you, you take your mind off your Torah study, and that's going to lead you to evil stuff, and eventually you're not going to go to Olam Haba, the world to come. You're going to go to the other place, which Jews do believe. There is a tradition in belief in heaven and hell. So at this section, we would call this pretty misogynistic, right? The Mishnah's opinion on women doesn't really agree with our modern sensibilities. Because in our society, and certainly in Judaism today, women are treated as equals to men in many Jewish circles, certainly not in Orthodoxy, but in although the Orthodox would tell you that women are treated equally, just differently. Um, but needless to say, women were not equal to men 2,000 years ago, or maybe even 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, or even today, especially when it comes to things like equal pay for equal work. So we should keep in mind that women did not receive the education that men received, and in general, they were not considered to be as intelligent as men. So it wasn't just a, it wasn't just a it was really a commentary on intellect, that women are frivolous, women chatter about nonsensical, unimportant things, women will take you away from the critical study of Torah, don't engage with them, certainly don't engage with your wife, and even more so with somebody else's wife, because it's all Norishkeit, it's all ridiculousness. So it's not surprising, therefore, that you'd have a sage who warns men about talking to women. And, because talking to women was seen as the antithesis to Torah learning. Men should avoid this. And because they assumed women couldn't talk Torah. And if you couldn't talk Torah, then you weren't important in their eyes. How do you like that? So, if we were to translate the advice that is given in this section to our situation, the advice is don't waste your time away with idle chit chat, which is important. You don't want to waste your time with gossip and idle chit chat, but primarily because that kind of chit chat limits the time that you have to spend on Torah. So it's interesting to note that this little section about chatting, conversing with women, doesn't say that Yosef ben Yochanan said it. It's simply appended to his statement. So it kind of makes it sound like he said it, but it was really the words of later sages that they appended to his statement. And they explain the statement and they expand upon it. So we get a little bit of the misogynistic insights into some of these sages who, didn't particularly want to have women around because women were silly and flitted about and couldn't carry on an intellectual conversation about Torah, which was critically important. Okay, we're now going to move on to the next zugot, the next pair who we're going to meet. So we have first the two Yosis, and now we're going to get to the next pair. And there's going to continue with this heavy concentration on learning and the continuation of tradition, which things that we've noted already, that this Kabbalah, this chain of tradition, along with the focus on Torah study, because after all, that's what this is all about. So now we get introduced to two more sages, Joshua ben Parahia and Nitai the Arbalite. And Arbalite is not a profession. The Arbalite, he was from, like we say, Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Elijah the Tishabite, Elijah the from Giladi. So he was an Arbalite, and they received the oral tradition from them. So who is the them? The them is the two Yoses that we just discussed. Joshua ben Parachia used to say, appoint for yourself a teacher, and acquire for yourself a companion, and judge all men with the scale weighted in his favor. So that's kind of a nice statement, right? And it says, Kanei lecha rav, acquire for yourself a rabbi, a teacher, and get yourself a companion or a good friend, and judge all people. This says men because that's how the Hebrew reads, but judge all people with the scale weighted in their favor. So, in other words, give people the benefit of the doubt. Even if it may look a little bit suspicious, you want to judge them fairly. So Joshua ben Parahia gives 3 pieces of advice, but they all have one thing in common. They're concerned with a person properly socializing with other human beings. So it's not just having your face in the book and studying Torah all day. It's also being part of a community and socializing with people. A person is not supposed to isolate themselves because isolation may lead to moral problems and to feelings of despair. Now, I find it very, very interesting that during this period of significant isolation that we are studying this particular Mishnah, because it was 2,000 years ago, not quite, but almost, that Joshua ben Parahia understood the importance of having a community, of having friends, of having teachers, and of judging people fairly. And so in order to accomplish that, he says you have to find yourself someone to teach you Torah, you have to have a friend, and you have to have a positive attitude when dealing with other people. So isolation is not the norm, nor is it that which we should hold up as the highest standard. We really want to have these relationships in our life. And when we hear the part of the Mishnah that says, acquire for yourself a teacher, it means a fixed teacher, a teacher with whom you can have a long-lasting relationship, a teacher who is ideally supposed to teach you everything there is to know. So for some of us, nowadays, that may not mean a classroom teacher. It may not mean a rabbi. In fact, it probably doesn't mean a rabbi. It probably means a parent or a grandparent, somebody who teaches you not just a skill set, but morally how to live as a human being. And I think that's a nice Mishnah. Avot de Rebbe Natan. Now, I mentioned to you that Pirkei Avot, unlike other sections of the Mishnah, does not have its own commentaries. But there is I don't want to call it a pseudo commentary because it's pretty big, but there is a kind of a commentary called Avot de Rebbe Natan. And in the expansion on this particular statement, it teaches an interesting parable. So I'm going to read that parable for you now. Rabbi Meir used to say, he that studies Torah with a single teacher, to whom may he be likened? To one who had a single field, part of which he sowed with wheat and part with barley, and planted part with olives and part with oak trees. Now that man is full of good and blessing. But when one studies with 2 or 3 teachers, he is like the one who has many fields, one who sows with wheat and one who sows with barley, and plants one with olives and one with oak trees. Now this man's attention is divided between many pieces of land without good or blessing. So, one field with the same 4 plants and trees in it is a good thing. Four fields or several fields, one with each of these crops or trees in it, is too many because you become distracted. So those parents who are taking their kids to soccer on one day and piano on one day and dance on one day and tutoring on one day, and these kids are so fractured, so split, and so stressed in all these things they do, maybe aren't learning as effectively if they had fewer things going on in their lives. I don't know, maybe. So one of the main purposes, so we learn about why having one teacher is a good thing, and hopefully a lifelong teacher, somebody with whom you can really share and understand about life. Secondly, one of the main purposes of having a friend, so we have a rabbi and now we have a friend, or we have a teacher and now a friend. One of the main purposes of having a friend is to study with that friend. When a person learns alone, there is no one to correct his mistakes, and no one to compliment him on his insight, and no one whom he can bounce his ideas off. When you sit and read something, maybe some new material, and you have questions, and you're the only one reading it, and there's no study guide, and there's no one to go to, you always have questions about what the dogs are very excited. There's somebody coming to the door. I'm expecting a delivery from Target this morning, so I'm sure that's what they hear. Unfortunately, there's nothing in it for them, so they're going to be disappointed. So as you're probably aware, Jewish learning always happens in what is known as Chavruta, and the word Chaver means friend. So that's why we call our program on Saturdays Shabbat Chaverim, because it is friends studying together on the Sabbath. And traditionally, and Chaverim, or Chavruta, literally means a social circle. So you're not getting together to socialize, but study was a form of social interaction. And usually this is two people sitting together, learning a Jewish text together. And I've had personal experience with this. It is a wonderful, wonderful experience. Usually one person is a little bit better at one thing and the other person's a little bit better at another thing. And the creativity and the insights that you come up with are so much more meaningful than if you were sitting there and trying to slog through something on your own. So Chavruta study has always been traditional in Jewish study, not just for Torah and Mishnah and so on, but for we had Chavruta study partners all through rabbinical school, and I'm not working with mine anymore, but I do have other Chavruta partners with whom I study. So so that was the second thing that Joshua ben Parahia said. He said, find yourself someone to teach you, a rabbi, acquire for yourself a friend for Torah study, and then finally, he said, judge every person with favor. And perhaps that is one of the sagest pieces of advice in the Mishnah, because that can really teach somebody a lot of lessons about how to succeed in general and in society, is when you judge somebody in a positive manner from the get-go. You can always find something worthwhile in that human being. And not judging a book by its cover, but allowing yourself to really get to know that person. And so one who's constantly skeptical of other people and their actions and their motives, they're not going to be able to have friends and teachers, because they're going to be a kind of a cynical, contradictory person. So we really see in this particular Mishnah an ideal that is shown in Mishnah Sanhedrin, when the rabbis actually legislated a court where they are obligated to search for a way to exonerate somebody who's accused. Always, always, always judging fairly if they possibly can. So we're going to end there today. Remember, I said that the next pair was Joshua ben Parahia and Nitai the Arbalite. We haven't gotten to Nitai yet. You're going to have to wait till tomorrow morning, till Friday, to hear about what he had to say. Hopefully, it won't be other derogatory things about women and how unintellectual they are. I'm going to say Lahitraot. Thanks again for tuning in. If you haven't told your friends to watch, you should tell them to watch. Lahitraot. Have a wonderful morning. Boker Tov. Bye bye.